pregnant person is the all lives matter of reproductive health care. September 27, 2015 by Lonesomeyogurt. Mural of a probably transphobic Roman midwife from the 1st century. It shows a picture. Earlier this month, transgender activist Trevor McDonald published 2 opinion pieces on the Huffington Post, each to attack the feminist organization Woman-Centered Midwifery. Woman-Centered Midwifery has earned the ire of the transgender movement for their open letter to the Midwives Alliance of North America, protesting MANA's Midwives of North America's decision to remove all mention of the word mother or woman from most of their literature. Woman-Centered Midwifery made a symbol of request, signed by over 100 prominent birth experts, activists, and feminists, that an organization devoted to promoting and organizing midwives shouldn't deny the link between womanhood and birth. This was, of course, enough to bring down a torrent of condemnation, harassment, and threats by transgender activists. Woman-Centered Midwifery is led in part by Mary Lou Singleton, whose Facebook comment is also the subject of the second hit piece. Full disclosure, Mary Lou is a friend of mine and someone I respect greatly. Her work with Stop Patriarchy's Abortion Freedom Ride, Deep Green Resistance, and the Women's Liberation Front, and other radical feminist and environmentalist resistance efforts have inspired, encouraged, and even facilitated my own activism. But these ridiculous smears would be inappropriate when aimed at any woman, not just one who has so clearly demonstrated her commitment to women's reproductive justice. MANA and other such groups that support the removal of woman from a discussion of midwifery believe that language is offensive due to the existence of a small minority of those who identify as men. As the logic goes, the obvious connection between pregnancy, birth, and womanhood must be excised so as not to invalidate their identities. Instead of discussing mothers or women, the millions of adult human females who birth children across the globe will have their identities stripped and be relabeled pregnant persons in deference to a handful of transgender activists. As I attempted to follow this logic, I was brought back to 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for his lynching of Trayvon Martin. As black anti-violence activists began rallying around the cry of Black Lives Matter, the pushback from white supremacists was immediate, and their foremost response was the formation of their counter-slogan, All Lives Matter. For those who are unclear, it must be said that All Lives Matter is a vicious expression of white supremacy hidden behind a facade of egalitarianism. Of course, all lives do matter in a moral sense, but as many black activists have pointed out, we currently live in a system where the value of white life is affirmed in a way black life is not. To the police, courts, and prisons, white lives, especially rich male white lives, have recognized importance. The growing piles of broken brown bodies across this nation make it clear that the same is clearly untrue for those who live outside whiteness, and that those inside it have shown little dedication to making their insistence on all lives matter a reality. Luckily, it seems as if most liberals and leftists are on board with rejecting all lives matter as a slogan, yet they ape its logic when they berate activists who center midwifery, abortion rights, and other reproductive justice issues on women as a class. Some white people do suffer state violence, but we all see. Some white people do suffer state violence, but we all see, hey, not everyone killed by police is black, as an insincere distraction. So why does the existence of a small minority of transgender parents turn, hey, not everyone who has an abortion is a woman, into a meaningful critique? Black activists have repeatedly explained that saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean others don't, and only the most disingenuous white folks disagree. But clearly, MANA and others who want to remove any mention of womanhood from a discussion of birth believe the statement, women give birth, does unjustly exclude anyone who might not identify as a woman. This double standard makes no sense. If the use of mother in a discussion of pregnancy is a violent act of erasure, then Black Lives Matter is no more justifiable. Do we really want to travel down that road? Police violence actually affects white people at a far greater rate than restrictions on abortion or access to childcare affect those who identify as transgender. But in both cases, that doesn't change the obvious fact that these groups are not the intended victims. Cops are militarized into hyper-masculine violence because a white supremacist state requires soldiers willing to do violence against black and brown citizens. White folks, especially poor white folks, are sometimes caught in the crossfire, but the bullets and batons are aimed directly at people of color. In the exact same way, abortion restrictions are put into place specifically because women are seen as incubators. Their bodies are such that men can fuck them, wait 9 months, and remove a, hopefully male, child. Female human beings who don't want to identify as women still possess these bodies, and they inherit the violence that has been constructed to keep those bodies down, a violence that is specifically tied to misogyny. As Ophelia Benson writes on her blog, it doesn't help pregnant people who don't identify as women to try to obscure the fact that attacks on abortion rights are highly political in a particular way, a sexist way, a misogynist way, an anti-woman way. A trans man who needs an abortion is caught in a system that was organized to thwart women's autonomy. Close quote. Gloria Steinem, or perhaps an elderly Irish cab driver, famously said, "If men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament." The reason transgender folks are refused abortion services, as well as any other reproductive care, has everything to do with the fact that they are seen as women, treated like women, and navigate a structure of policy and law imbued with intentional anti-woman violence. Sacrificing those obvious connections in the name of inclusion is a victory for right-wing fascists. Inclusion has become the ultimate liberal fetish. Unfortunately, the uncritical expansion of categories to protect feelings is less inclusion than dilution. All lives matter is, after all, a demand for inclusion, specifically the inclusion of white trauma into the narrative of black resistance. The classic line used by men's rights activists, "Sometimes men get beat up by women too," is a demand that efforts against domestic violence be inclusive as well. But none of these discussions are improved in the least solely by making language less precise. The whole project of politics is placing the complex web of human interaction into a formula of power. Who does what to whom? And when we say white cops use violence against black civilians, the first world extracts resources from the third world, or men restrict reproductive health care for women, we aren't claiming that other individual experiences are impossible. We're saying that, beyond those individual experiences, an organizing structure exists that shapes how groups of people interact. If your goal is to despecify language to the point where all possible experiences are represented equally, then yes, by all means, replace woman with pregnant person. And while you're at it, replace Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter. Demand justice for incarcerated persons, not people of color. Set up shelters open to the battered, not abused women. Raise awareness for colonized individuals, not the third world. Combat discrimination based on orientation, not homophobia. Then sit back, relax, and feel really, really great about just how inclusive you are. But if your goal is a political analysis that actually confronts power, do just the opposite. Identify the white supremacy at the heart of police brutality. Pinpoint the specific victims and perpetrators of domestic violence. Name the agents of global empire, and yes, be honest about who bears the brunt of reproductive oppression. At the heart of Black Lives Matter is the belief that oppressed populations have the right to narratives that center their experience of oppression, even if others who suffer from their periphery effects may feel momentarily excluded. Reject this or accept it, but don't apply it selectively. Victims of abortion restrictions and over-medicalized birth may indeed be pregnant persons, but only in the same sense that those left bleeding, battered, and dead in our streets by psychopathic cops are policed persons. Comments. Red Peach Moon says, "Excellent piece, thank you. I'll share this and probably be banned at a certain feminist site. Confoundingly, I was banished from a more radical site for not being more vehemently anti-trans last week. Is this not the topic that needs attention and discussion?" Hearth Rising says, "Once again, Jonah, you hit the ball out of the park. Clear and excellent analysis." Darrington says, "A blast of common sense." Love Truth Courage says, "Obviously women give birth and should not be erased from that due to a tiny minority of self-described trans people. Their identity is at odds with science and reality." That said, your argument comparing this erasure to All Lives Matter is off base. Whites are not the majority of people killing blacks. The vast majority of blacks, 91% according to FBI stats, are killed by, wait for it, other blacks. 7% of blacks are killed by all whites, including Hispanics. 14% of whites, including Hispanics, are killed by blacks. Yes, police violence against African Americans is a real issue, and police should absolutely be criminally prosecuted if their actions are not justifiable. But blacks are much more likely to kill whites than the reverse. Keep in mind that whites, including Hispanics, are the vast majority of the population, and blacks are only a paltry 13% of the USA's population when contemplating 7% of blacks being killed by whites versus 14% of whites being killed by blacks. Most killings are not motivated by racial hatred in the USA. A person is most likely to be killed by a family member or close associate. Only blacks can stop black-on-black murders. Of course, all people deserve justice and therefore all lives matter. No apologies for the truth. I've told an unpopular truth and I'm prepared for my crucifixion by liberals. Unabashed Calabash says, I have to disagree that only blacks can stop black-on-black murders. Have you heard of the phenomenon of white flight? In the 60s and 70s, successful middle-class black families began moving into historically white neighborhoods in downtown districts. The white people fled to the suburbs, thus creating the suburbs. And funding was all but cut off to these now all-black urban areas, which became the inner city. To give you another example, there used to be a program at an Ivy League school for black youth who were admitted. The program was a summer school that gave crash courses in remedial math and English, composition, etc. Remember, these were students who excelled in their inner city high schools, receiving top marks and taking part in extracurricular activities. Up until the program was instituted, the Ivy League school had a near 100% dropout rate of black students due to failing grades. After the program was instituted, the graduation rate of black students rose above that of white students, likely because they had more to lose and more to gain. What does this mean? Simply that they were not receiving the same education as their white peers. Despite excelling in their urban, mostly black schools, they arrived not knowing the basics and needing remedial courses to avoid flunking out. It also shows they were smart enough to learn all these basics in a summer intensive course, which is pretty amazing. The program was later killed by the black dean of studies, a conservative who didn't like the affirmative action's implications. The black graduation rate once again dropped nearly to zero. This lack of funding and opportunities is a kind of enforced poverty. Growing up thus disenfranchised and looked down upon by the white man, I suggest you read Native Son, with few opportunities to get ahead in life no matter how hard you try. So if you are particularly bright, clever, or motivated, as the vast majority of people, the average, aren't, you're really screwed. Do you blame people for turning to crime, to stealing and drug dealing, easy money? Particularly when they need protection in their own neighborhoods and thus for survival become part of gangs? It is because of gang activity and gang loyalty that crime that black-on-black violence takes place. White people are the ones who need to solve black-on-black crime by giving equal funding to the inner city, strengthening social programs, improving education, and giving more affirmative action opportunities to make up for the extreme lack and prejudice people of color are facing. Providing rehabilitation for petty criminals rather than harsh prison sentences, with job training and help with housing for people on the fringe, especially for the very poor and the homeless, as a part of this effort. Police officers and social workers should be schooled how to work for, not against, the community. First, so they come to trust them, and second, to foster growth and cooperation. In my opinion, gun control should be implemented and drugs should be legalized and treated as a public health issue, but that's another debate. The point is, it's whites who can solve black-on-black crime, just as it's whites who must ultimately solve racism. For a parallel, it's men who must ultimately solve sexism. Women can fight all they want, but they can't overturn the dominant paradigm as long as men insist on treating them as second-class citizens. Love, Truth, Courage says, you've made many good points I agree with. Of course I've heard of white flight, and I agree African Americans need and deserve better opportunities academically and in the workforce. However, lack of privilege doesn't cause murder by itself. Many people around the world have it much worse than the average African American, yet don't resort to murder. In fact, the USA is the most violent country not at war. I agree that white people need to be part of the solution to economic woes and hopelessness, but they cannot stop any person from pulling the trigger if that person feels justified in doing so. I agree we need better gun control, especially taking guns away from the mentally ill, abusers, gang members, and other criminals. I agree that drugs should be legalized and treated as a public health issue. So it seems we agree on many things here, but it's a fact that many around the world live in far greater poverty and hopelessness, and yet they don't resort to murder at the same rates. Lonesomeyogurt says, white people are much, much more likely to kill black people through enforced poverty, disease, incarceration, global war, as well as straight murder. The only way black people can be made out as more violent is through the erasure of systematic violence on the part of whites. If you don't see that, you're hopeless. No one is going to crucify you. They're just going to laugh at you because your ideology is stupid. Love, Truth, Courage said, so your strongest argument is name-calling. Point taken. Lonesome Yogurt says, it's not name calling, I'm just telling you your position's really stupid. When inner city black kids start dropping bombs on foreign nations, stealing their resources, selling them into slavery, and destroying their cultures through ethnic cleansing and genocide, I'll believe they're more violent. Red Peach Moon says, well said. Penny White says, thank you. As a white supporter of Black Lives Matter, I was horrified by that comment. We cannot allow something as important as women's rights to be poisoned by racism or transphobia. Yes, there is misogyny in the trans community, but there's also a passionate feminism, and I know many trans women who are extremely radical. I have 2 trans women friends make Julie Bindel sound like a male apologist. I'm not kidding, they want cis men eliminated. Let's not lump all trans women into one group. Yes, some are sexist Barbie girls, but even they have a common enemy with all women, and that is violent predatory men. We lose powerful, passionate allies when we exclude women based on race or chromosomes. Lonesome Yogurt says, radical does not mean extreme. I could care less if certain types of men want other types of men eliminated. Plenty of men have violent fantasies like that. But if these friends of yours think that woman is an identity, they aren't radical. Sorry. Equating race and chromosomes as equally meaningful in relation to womanhood is absurd. That's like saying we ought not to exclude people of color based on gender or skin color. Biological sex is the structure upon which gender is built. Those who claim womanhood without being biologically female are doing so solely through an identification with socially constructed stereotypes they have identified as natural. Like all misogynists, they believe that femininity is a natural aspect of womanhood. Francois Tremblay says, I'm not surprised that trans people want to kill their opposition. After all, their favorite slogan is Die, cis scum. We know they're violent defenders of the status quo. We know they make death threats against radfems on a regular basis and project their violent impulses upon them as well. None of this is news. Unabashed Calabash says, I have to agree with Jonah. Even not taking into account the history of colonialism from European powers, British, Belgians, French, Dutch, etc., the U.S. has been the greatest killer of poor people of color worldwide since World War II ended, in the name of our freedom. Read, in the name of upholding our unsustainable style of living, which is the American dream. Try researching shadow wars, puppet governments, and covert ops by the CIA post-World War II in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The CIA are also the biggest drug brokers in the world. In terms of simply African Americans, the deaths of African Americans due to lack of access to medical care, good health care, and high incarceration rates for crimes which are committed as much as by whites, drug crimes, petty property crimes, as well as I said, enforced poverty. Poverty is the greatest genocide of our times. Millions of people all over the world die because of it. Jonah is completely right that even post-slavery, far more blacks have died at the hands of whites in the U.S. than vice versa, in systematic ways there will be no accounting for. It's the underdog who has to resort to crime to try to claw his way up to where the puppet masters pull the strings, and it's he who gets smacked down for it, not the real criminals. Furthermore, you're wrong about the U.S. being the most violent country in the world not involved in war. Honduras wins that prize, with many other Central American countries and Mexico a close second. You're entirely wrong about desperate young men not losing all respect for life when they grow up seeing the lives of those like them of so little worth. Not turning to crime to try to gain a foothold in the world. What do you think the gang life and drug trade is in Mexico and Central America, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths? Do you blame the young men in Honduras that joined the Mara Salvatrucha? How about the young men in Mexico who get paid $1,000 a month to be sicarios for the cartels? Less if they're lookouts? These are the same young men who end up as cannon fodder, their heads on pikes. This is a far larger problem than black-on-black crime in the U.S., but it's for the same reasons. Systematic disenfranchisement, poverty, and racism. You don't see rich white Mexicans joining gangs. There's obviously a statistical correlation between crime and poverty and disenfranchisement of a group of people. It's not only desperation, but it's also, often rightly, perceived as the only way for the little guy to get ahead. How is Chapo Guzman all that different from someone like Dick Cheney or Texas nuclear waste dumping billionaire Harold Simmons? Because his murders are more apparent? You're entirely wrong in your assertion that black Americans are the only ones this issue affects, and such an ignorant position reveals your racism, or at the very least, a bias born of an astounding lack of information. I suggest you do a little research before making such claims next time. Oh, and how could I leave out the Spanish? Oh, some of the greatest European colonizers of all time. Love, Truth, Courage says, I agree that all people in the USA deserve a better medical care system. We could start by getting rid of insurance companies that are no more than expensive middlemen. We need a national program, single payer. As I've already said, we need to legalize drugs and provide rehabilitation for addicts. We need prevention programs for young people. Yes, history and world events are very complicated. I see you've simply omitted all the good things the USA has done for the world. Why do so many want to come to the USA if it's 100% bad? It's obvious to me that you haven't traveled as much, nor do you have a global perspective, if you can make such dubious claim as the US has been the greatest killer of poor people of color worldwide since World War II ended. I have traveled widely. I've been to every continent and major world region in the world. Many countries were full of starving people until the USA came along and bolstered their economies. For example, South Korea. Do you know that 90% of South Korea's economy was once dependent on the USA? The millions saved from starvation and given a decent standard of living would disagree with your one-sided portrait of the USA. The USA has also generously given aid to countries all over the world in times of crises, more than any other country. We've provided food, money, medical care, sanitation, and shelter to millions. It's simply untrue that the average African American in the USA today has to resort to crime in order to improve their standard of living. I know many African Americans who worked hard, got an education, and live in upper middle class lifestyles. It can be done. I suppose it is far easier not to do it and to make excuses instead. Yes, Honduras is more violent than the USA, but many do consider it to be in a state of conflict that verges on civil war. The same can be said of my husband's country, Mexico. Mexico's violence is heavily related to the war on drugs, which I strongly oppose. You're right that violence there is a bigger problem than black-on-black crime in the USA, and I never implied or stated otherwise. I think our difference is what constitutes a civil war. I'd say Mexico is essentially in one now, with approximately 90,000 dead since December 2006. That's why I wrote that the USA is the most violent country not at war. The not at war part is important. You write, you're entirely wrong in your assertion that black Americans are the only ones this issue affects. Where did I write that? Where? It's easy to set a straw man up and knock it down. However, my point was that there are people living in far more dire economic conditions worldwide than the average African American lives who do not resort to murder at the same rates. Do you get it now? Do you know how much money average people, not oligarchs, in Russia, India, and China live on? You have no idea of how much research I have done or how many places in the world I've been to and helped people in. Yes, I could be biased, but so could you. You list nothing at all good about the USA and American accomplishments. We've helped many people too, so the story is not entirely one-sided as you pretend. Perhaps you should do some research of your own. Clearly you're biased and a member of the Blame America for Everything crowd. The world has plenty of problems. The world had plenty of problems long before America came around. Do some research. Francois Tremblay says, let's be honest here, you're posturing. I have told an unpopular truth and I'm prepared for my crucifixion by liberals. What liberals? I don't think anyone's a liberal here. Silly racist troll. Unabashed Calabash says, I have traveled widely. Not only traveled, which is skin deep, but lived. I've lived in Japan, Spain, Saudi Arabia, the UK, the US, and Mexico, where I now live. I've traveled in Asia, including South Korea, Europe, and Latin America. You were saying? NAFTA is the reason the poorest Mexicans resorted to illegal immigration, risking their lives and abandoning their homeland. Interestingly, the illegal immigration rate has dropped to nearly zero after the recession and stricter, even more inhumanitarian border policies and cartel fighting close to the border. It's no longer worth it for the little money that can be made. That might change again after the steep devaluing of the peso last fall, especially as it's continuing to climb. It's U.S. policies that have caused so many problems in Latin America post-World War II, through the legacy of colonialism of the Spanish certainly left a lot of instability before we came along. The war on drugs being waged by the U.S. is responsible for a lot of the problems in Mexico and Central America right now, and in Colombia and Bolivia before, and still. I left out, I realized, the Vietnam War and the Gulf War, as well as the occupation of Afghanistan. The Taliban were trained by and armed by U.S. forces, as were the original members of Los Zetas in Mexico. All of that is incidental to the fact that it's the American dream, which has caused, by far, the most damage across the world. Our unsustainable lifestyles, the lifestyles we aspire to for everyone, are what drive our wars and our political and financial exploitation of other countries. Furthermore, we are the biggest culprits in world pollution. Americans have a much larger carbon footprint than any other nationality in the world, much, much larger. We waste an incredible amount of food and other resources and products. There are not enough resources in the world to have everyone else raised to our standard of living. So by continuing to champion that standard of living, we're proclaiming ourselves kings and everyone else peasants. We must not do so in good conscience. I think I mentioned that poverty is the greatest genocide of modern times, and it's the U.S. and the U.S. mentality of self above the rest that is the greatest culprit in enforcing the poverty of other nations. All the supposed help and aid we have given is mere tokenism, and often unwanted, violent, and paternalistic. Even charities with the best intentions march in and try to impose an American way of life on a highly different culture. Most Americans think their way of doing things is the best. Furthermore, the U.S. is in deep debt to other countries who have given us an enormous amount of aid, and it's the irresponsible fiscal habits of American citizens and corporations that's resulted in a recession that affected the entire world, including the Third World, which was already struggling and hit much harder than the rest. I don't blame just the U.S., however. All of the West, as well as the countries that aspire to be like it, including Asian superpowers, are to blame. This is the new Roman Empire, and it's just as hedonistic, selfish, and likely to drive itself to extinction. Whatever you may say about countries at war or not at war, there's no declared war going on in Mexico or Central America. And they're facing the very same problems faced by the poorest people, often people of color, in the U.S., only on a grander scale, resulting in more deaths. Of course, there are many African Americans who do well and don't resort to crimes. Your point is? I think you're discounting not only the legacy of slavery, but the racism that drives people to despair. The crime of young African American males is a self-fulfilling prophecy in a country that sees them as dangerous, as criminals, and as less deserving of respect and high positions in society. The messages about who we are sent by society at large are perhaps the most important factors in shaping who we become. People from such backgrounds of poverty and entrenched racism, who have a strong and supportive family to help them overcome the odds, are lucky. And yes, the disparity between the haves and have-nots is wider than ever. The U.S. has the largest income gap in the world. People of color are disproportionately affected by that. And low-income urban and rural areas continue to suffer from lack of funds and support, all of which makes crime a more attractive option to the disenfranchised young people, some of whom, as I said, are forced into it for protection. This is common in the most violent areas. I didn't set up any straw men. It's you who singled out blacks as having the most problems and highest crime rate of anyone in a country not at war. I simply pointed out that that's not true, and that the factors that drive young men in countries like Honduras and Mexico into crime are the same as those that drive young black men from poor and dangerous urban areas into crime, not to mention the specifically anti-African American racism of the U.S. This seems patently obvious. I don't deny the U.S. has done some good things. It doesn't make up for all the bad it's done, and some of those good things have been simply cover for our crimes aboard. The U.S. as a country is also extremely nationalistic, jingoistic, and xenophobic. The best thing the U.S. has going for it is its activism, which is stronger than that of many other superpower countries, precisely because it's so corrupt in so many ways. It reminds me of how there's more activism in Mexico because of its transparent corruption, including activism and the push for education among the least educated of the populace, the indigenous people of the South. In Italy, too, I observed greater awareness of the state of politics among young people, again, because of the more transparent corruption there. Historically, the plutocratic U.S. has been great at hiding its crimes from the public, but this is not the case anymore, especially post-recession. You can say I'm biased all you like. I'll say the same to you. I'm not saying most other countries are better, especially if they aspire to be like us. There are only a few more socialist egalitarian countries out there I think are starting to have it right. Stop trying to justify your racist views and maybe do a little re-examining of your thoughts and feelings on the issue. Ex-homebirther says, MANA won't change policies to save lives. They had data about home birth fatalities and hid it for 5 years. After the data was released, it showed a totally unacceptable level of fatality for breech, twin, and VBAC births at home, vaginal birth after cesarean. They are charlatans that don't care about women or their babies. They changed their policy only to increase their potential customer base. I am very upset that they changed policies for personal gain but not for safety reasons. This is about home birth because the midwife credential that MANA represents is too unskilled to practice within a hospital. They cannot be bothered to get a nursing degree.